Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I am Adrian Ford, and we are here for the first of a 7-part series as we bumble along the Bardo, Lincoln in the Bardo, by George Saunders. And we are here for the first part, which means chapters 1 through 27. What happened in these chapters? Well, we open with Hans Vollmann telling Roger Bevins III about how he was an older man but a newlywed and very much in love when he died. The two are present to welcome a new and young apparition to their company. In chapter 2, we learn that Willie Lincoln, Abraham's son, is deathly ill. But the office being what it is and the times calling for what they call for, Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln are forced to entertain guests in a much distracted fashion while their son burns with the fever upstairs. Then, Willie Lincoln dies. Surprise. Then, we learn about our old friend Roger Bevins III. This coming to us from page 25. One of these days I'm going to learn to prepare these pages before I start shooting, but from 25 we learn about Roger Bevins. A day or so after a particularly frank talk in which Gilbert stated his intention to henceforth, quote, live correctly, end quote, I took a butcher knife to my room and, after writing a note to my parents, I am sorry, was the gist, and another to him, I have loved, and therefore depart fulfilled, I slit my wrists rather savagely over a porcelain tub. Feeling nauseous at the quantity of blood and its sudden percussive redness against the whiteness of the tub, I settled myself woozily down on the floor, at which time well, it is a little embarrassing, but let me just say it. I changed my mind. And on the next page, page 26 into 27, knowing that my only hope was to be found by one of the servants, I stumbled to the stairs and threw myself down. From there, I managed to crawl into the kitchen, which is where I remain. I am waiting to be discovered, having come to rest on the floor, head against the stove, upended chair nearby, sliver of an orange peel against my cheek, so that I may be revived and rise and clean up the awful mess I have made. Mother will not be pleased, and go outside into that beautiful world, a new and more courageous man, and begin to live. Will I follow my predilection? I will, with gusto. Having come so close to losing everything, I am freed now of all fear, hesitation, and timidity, and once revived, intend to devoutly wander the earth, imbibing, smelling, sampling, loving whomever I please, touching, tasting, standing very still among the beautiful things of this world. We learn that of Roger Bevins, confirming suspicions from earlier that these spirits have not accepted their finality. Then we meet both Willie Lincoln and Reverend Everly Thomas during a marathon stream of consciousness. They decide they need to show young Lincoln an important something, and along the way they pick up both Elizabeth Crawford as well as Sam Longstreet. The important something was Elise Traynor, a girl who was only 3 years Willie's senior at the time of her death, but she was much more, shall we say, worldly when she passed. And as opposed to the seemingly static nature of the other spirits, her condition seems to be getting worse as time goes on. We are not sure exactly how this is getting worse, but I assume we're going to get that explained a little later. And because of this, the group urges Willie to pass their plane of existence by walking him to his grave, and they arrive just in time for a cameo from Mr. Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln shows up and takes Willie's coffin from its perch and opens it to admire the boy. And I'm going to reference something here that I'm going to reference probably many times in this series. Lincoln's Melancholy. For this, we're heading to the notes on page 253 of this. After the actual book part is done, we get all of these wonderful historical notes. And we get this about Abraham Lincoln. Physical strength and athletic prowess. For example, Lincoln was an impressive wrestler and, according to James Short, could lift 1,000 pounds of shot by main strength. I'm not sure what lifting something by main strength means. I'm assuming it's something like a deadlift, perhaps. Could deadlift 1,000 pounds of shot, which would be incredibly impressive. Probably not entirely true. But Lincoln was absolutely known for, was heralded for his strength and toughness. So that is something to keep in mind. During this visit, Abe breaks down, and so does Willie. Willie ends up, quote, entering himself as everyone leaves his graveside. The scene causes such a stir that the spirits of our core group are realizing there are other spirits around them that they've never even met before, but they're showing up to have a look at this guy holding his dead son. Nobody comes to see them. Why is this guy coming to hold his dead son's body? Everyone thereafter wants to talk to Willie, who was granted herein all of the sway and popularity that he had in life. The first thing that I think is absolutely necessary to maybe discuss a little bit here is that I have read several texts, as well as been told in multiple classes, that one of the extraordinary things about this time period is that there was absolutely a zeitgeist. There was a spirit of the times. And if today's spirit of the times could be sort of summarized as taking pictures of your lunch and sending it out on the internet, and you're allowed to think deeply about things, but you're probably an asshole if you do. Like, that's sort of the spirit of the times. Just accept what everyone accepts and take pictures of your lunch. That's what we'll be remembered for. The spirit of these times, the times that we're talking about here, these were times to be sullen, solemn, and morose. There is a reason that Edgar Allan Poe knew so much popularity when he was writing in his day. The spirit of the times, the zeitgeist of these times, was to be sort of sullen, was to be sad, was to wear this glum on your face. But here's the thing. Again, referencing Lincoln's Melancholy by Joshua Wolf Shank, an absolutely stunning read if you ever get to read it. Even in these times, when it was the cool thing to be the sad guy, Lincoln was quoted by one of his contemporaries as being, and I quote here, dripping with melancholy. This was a sad guy among sad men. He was an absolutely destroyed individual from early in life, apparently. But it is necessary to sort of keep that in the back of one's mind while reading this. And it's one thing, I'll be 100% honest, I didn't necessarily give George Saunders the credit of being able to pull off. But you can tell that. He's captured the spirit of the times here with all of the quotes that he uses from other texts and the actual characters, how they interact. He really catches the demeanor that one might expect during this time period, if it is perhaps a little silly around the edges. But I want to read something else from Lincoln's Melancholy, this from page 197. This is about how Abraham Lincoln responded to Willie's death. The next turning point came with Willie Lincoln's death in February 1862. Mary Lincoln said that, though Lincoln, quote, was a religious man always, end quote, his ideas about hope and faith began to change, by which he probably meant hope and faith in the afterlife. After Willie was interred, Lincoln went several times to look at his body in its tomb. He asked an Army officer, "Did you ever dream of a lost friend and feel that you were having direct communion with that friend, and yet a consciousness that it was not a reality?" And the man said he thought all may have had such an experience. Lincoln said, "So do I dream of my boy Willie," sobbing and shaking with emotion. In this vulnerable period, Lincoln was influenced by the Reverend Phineas D. Gurley, whose Presbyterian church he attended. In his eulogy over Willie, Gurley preached that, quote, "in the hour of trial," end quote, one must look to, quote, "him who sees the end from the beginning and doeth all things well." With confidence in God, Gurley said, quote, "Our sorrows will be sanctified and made a blessing to our souls, and by we shall have occasion to say with blended gratitude and rejoicing, it is good for us that we have been afflicted." Lincoln asked Gurley to write out a copy of the eulogy. In the trials ahead, he would hold to this idea as if it were a life raft. Abraham Lincoln was, in fact, this destroyed by Willie's death. And there are probably a lot of reasons why. This coming to us from page 23 of Lincoln in the Bardo. Imagine the pain of that, Andrew, to drop one's precious son into that cold stone like a broken bird and to be on your way. That, I think, is the crux and the heart of the matter. But there's something else in that little quote that we're going to pick up on and carry forward. Imagine the pain of that, Andrew, to drop one's precious son into that cold stone like some broken bird and be on your way. I've lost my place. I think I skipped a number here. The question of Abraham Lincoln and religion sort of goes hand in hand with the question of Abraham Lincoln and animals. And in turn, goes hand in hand with the question of Willie Lincoln and animals. So look, I read Lincoln's Melancholy in, I believe, 2007. So it is a long time since I've been in this text, and there's several things I couldn't find that I wanted to reference for this video. But one of them was a conversation that he had with a preacher, and I couldn't find that conversation in here. But I remember the gist of it. And, well, let me start with this from Lincoln in the Bardo from page 20. This is from one of the historical quotes we're getting from, "We found the carriage and made for home, where our own children were, thanks be to a merciful God, were resting peacefully." One of these people who's leaving that party during which Willie Lincoln had died. They're saying that we left that party knowing all of this sadness was taking place, and we were going home where, thanks be to the mercy of the Lord, our children were alive. Mercy, the merciful Lord. Merciful to who? There is a story of Abraham Lincoln attending church during the Civil War. And during this, after everything had gone on, and the preacher had preached, the pastor had pastored, Abraham Lincoln was talking to the pastor, and the pastor said, "I hope God will be on our side." And Abraham Lincoln corrected him and said, "Hey, I hope we are on his." Stating, look, everything's sort of malleable. Everything's up in the air. I don't know if we're the right guys. I don't know if we're the good guys. Maybe we're the bad guys. There was a lot. The Bible during the Civil War was used to enforce the ideas of slavery. It was not strictly a text where people said, all men are created equal, we should not have slaves. there's a lot of stuff about slavery in the Bible. There's a lot about what did Jesus say? Jesus said something about you should serve your masters well, something like that. I don't have the exact quote. I watched a lot of Hitchens, so I know he said something like that. But Abraham Lincoln corrected the preacher and said, "No, I hope we're on his," assuming he's got the right angle on things. So Abraham Lincoln is someone who is always willing to undercut the presiding assumptions of society. He was someone who grew up reading in a time and place where people didn't read. He was someone, I'm assuming we're going to have time to get into this at some point in the text, but it didn't really present itself here. In Lincoln's Melancholy, there is a poem that is attributed to Abraham Lincoln oftentimes. It is assumed that he was the author of this poem, and it was published in his day when people like him didn't write poetry. So he's someone who was always a little bit different and always willing to question things and look at things in a different light. And that light often came from a dark place. A man who was described as dripping with melancholy and who had what was several times in Lincoln's life, he was on suicide watch. People in his whatever town he was living in just assumed, we're getting close for old Abe, let's keep an eye on him. Several times in his life, at least twice, I believe. So one of the signs of sort of being depressed, having a major depressive disposition, is an overwhelming sympathy for animals. And again, here's two things that I couldn't find in here. Well, I got to go back to Lincoln in the Bardo first. So why am I bringing this up? That he's being so sympathetic to animals. In Lincoln in the Bardo, on page 53, we get this little ditty. When confronted with some little unfairness, this is about Willie. When confronted about some little unfairness, his face would darken with concern, and his eyes would well up with tears, as if, in that unfortunate particular, he had intuited the injustice of the larger enterprise. Once, a playmate brought along a dead robin he had just killed with a stone, held tongue-like between two sticks. Willie spoke brusquely to the boy, seized the bird away, took it off to bury it. He was low and quiet for the rest of the day. This being, Willie's friend had killed a bird and brought it to Willie to sort of boast, and Willie yanked it from him and took it and gave it a proper burial. And he was sad the rest of the day, right? First off, the literary moment in here, when Abraham Lincoln's son Willie was taken from him in what he thought was an unfortunate and unfair manner, he didn't just let it, he took him away and gave him a proper burial. He's going back to the little baby broken bird and revisiting, isn't he? So there's a literary moment there in which Willie Lincoln is acting as Abraham Lincoln in the small context to the large context of this story. But there are stories about Abraham Lincoln's life, again, that I couldn't find in Lincoln's Melancholy, but I'm 99% positive this is where I got them from. Other boys, when Abraham Lincoln was a child, used to crack open turtles or would set them on fire. Abraham Lincoln thought that this was abominable and used to lecture them. Another thing, pardon me, boys used to set ants on fire as well, or torture ants. I mean, this is something that goes on to this day, right? Ants being the precocious little pricks that they are, and probably deserving of such terrible ends. But anyway, Lincoln said to one of his friends, an ant's life is as precious to it as our life is to us. So there is this this deal with both Willie and Abraham, who are so sympathetic towards animals. And this is one of the ways, undoubtedly, where they mirror each other. And it is sort of insinuated whenever you read about Willie Lincoln that Abraham loved him so much and so especially because there was a special bond between them. What was that special bond? One can only assume that that special bond was that Abraham Lincoln saw so much of himself in young Willie. Young Willie being likable, being intelligent, being emotional, but grounded, I think. So there are all these things where there are all of these ways in which Lincoln sees himself in Willie, and that is why Willie was so precious to him. And that said, Abraham Lincoln, who was always especially, I want to say religious, but I will settle for spiritual. Abraham Lincoln, who was always especially spiritual, because he was willing. He was willing to contest the presumed opinions on religion in his time. He is someone who, in the very least, struggled greatly with religion. It is important to notice in this text how often it is cited that prayer is going on. Someone is praying. I'm praying for Abraham Lincoln in the wake of his son. I'm praying for Willie before he dies. I'm praying that everyone has their health, etc. This Christian prayer, it is important to note in this text, and I'm assuming it's going to play a bigger role later on. This idea of Christian prayer is entombed within a text citing the Bardo. The Bardo, not a Christian idea. The Bardo loosely sort of grafts on to the idea of limbo in Christianity, but it's not precise. And this imprecision is something that I do not especially understand at this point. It's something I'm trying to do a little bit more reading extracurricularly to understand that I might be able to decipher something better later in the series. But because of the fact that George Saunders was so sure to title this Lincoln in the Bardo, not Lincoln in Limbo, although there's sort of a ring to that. Lincoln in the Bardo. These Christian prayers must, one assumes, unless there's some mixture of religions going on, these Christian prayers must be going unanswered by a merciful God. Again, merciful to who? To whom? To whom is this God merciful? Right? Just keep in the back of your mind how much prayer is going on. And while we're talking about George Saunders, I think it's important for me to throw this out there, and I should have started the video with this, so I apologize. There's probably a whole lot of people who read this text for the first time and just have no goddamn clue what's going on, because Saunders doesn't care about conformity of form. He doesn't care that, hey, this isn't supposed to be a paragraph break. He doesn't, sometimes you're just not going to get your period. And that's not, hopefully everyone gets their period. What I mean is there's not always going to be punctual end to a sentence. Hopefully you've got your period. There's not always going to be a punctual end to a sentence, because Saunders knows that he has led you in such a direction, he doesn't have to finish that thought. So baby, he's not gonna. But we are in the hands of a more than capable author that is going to confuse at times, but not in the same way that a William Faulkner confuses. There's not too many words here that we don't understand, just some structure, not even really sentence structure, but sentence form, and structure of story. Which, by the way, I've got another book that's written sort of like this that I'm going to bring out later in the series. But we are in the hands of an author that is able to make these sorts of allusions in his text. This comes to us from page 17. This is from Kuhnhart and Kuhnhart. They are quoting Fire, Fire, or Ship on Fire, which the Hutchison family apparently had sang. The cheeks of the sailors grew pale at the sight, and their eyes glistened with gleam of light, and the smoke in thick wreaths mounted higher and higher. O God, it is fearful to perish by fire. O God, it is fearful to perish by fire. This is being given to us through historical texts. It is fearful to perish by fire. Oh God, it is fearful to perish by fire. This is a callback to page 9, where we get this by Kuhnhart and Kuhnhart. Willie was burning with fever on the night of the 5th. As his mother dressed for the party, he drew every breath with difficulty. She could see that his lungs were congested, and she was frightened. It's fearful to perish by fire. So we're with an author who's willing to enable cognitively to call back like that. So I think there's going to be a lot of callbacks later in the book to this very first section. We've just got to keep our eyes open for it. And on page 19, I think this was so weird that I'm willing to bet that it comes back at some point in the future. This, page 19 from chapter 5. Chapter 5 is completely this. I'm not going to read you all of chapter 5, just the first page, but I'm also going to leave out where it's cited from. The first quote, many guests especially recalled the beautiful moon that shone that evening. The second quote, in several accounts of the evening, the brilliance of the moon was remarked upon. The third quote, a common feature in those narratives is the golden moon hanging quaintly above the scene. The fourth quote, there was no moon that night, and the sky was heavy with clouds. The fifth quote, a fat green crescent hung above the mad scene like a stolid judge inured to all human folly. The sixth quote, the moon that night was yellow-red, as if reflecting the light of some earthly fire. I'm expecting this weird little chapter to come back into play at some point. But I think something to be gleaned from this is that it is reflective of the way that truth is malleable to the way we choose to romanticize things. And you also have to understand, truth is malleable to how we decide to romanticize things, but it's also malleable to who you are, where you were, and what you were looking at when you experienced said thing, right? Maybe to some of them, at the point in the night when they looked at the moon, there was no moon, it was clouded. At some point in the night, the moon was brilliant and bright. And maybe if you caught it in the in-between, it looked kind of yellowish. So I think what's going to be happening here is we're going to get it wrapped up that all of these spirits who are in the Bardo, this type of limbo, who we learn on 73, by the way. I'm going to read this real quickly. Truth be told, there was not one among the many here, not even the strongest, who did not entertain some lingering doubt about the wisdom of his or her choice. Pardon me. I think the wisdom of said choice, the choice in question, is remaining in the Bardo. Are they questioning their choice to remain in the Bardo because of how they were looking at their life? It is abundantly clear at this point that people are sort of not stuck maybe stuck is the best word. Not forced into the Bardo, but sort of stuck there. The way some people are stuck in phases of their lives. If you question yourself and can you make it in the real world, maybe you don't leave the house at 18, 19, 20. If you are questioning whether or not you can find a different job, maybe you stick at the first job you got way longer than you probably should have, and you don't jump ship to something better for you. That seems to be what's going on with the Bardo here, as all of these people are questioning certain things that they didn't maybe get to in their life, the way they look at their life, the way they observed the moon, right? All of these types of things. The last thing I really want to comment on here is a small maybe reference. So they, at the very end of this selection of chapters, the barons show up, and the barons curse like a storm. They say the F word, the C word, the S word. They're very fond of all of these words, and they are the barons. And I wonder, in my heart of hearts, is this George Saunders making a reference to the aristocrats? If you don't know what that means, probably don't YouTube the aristocrats joke. Don't do it. It's not good for you. You shouldn't look up versions of the aristocrats joke. It's not something you want to do. I'll tell you one. I mean, if you really want to know it, I think the important thing to remember about the aristocrats, well, let's just start. So the aristocrats, there's a family